This week I'm joined by Gregory Marks, who is an Australian PhD student writing his thesis on the Posthuman and the Gothic in Thomas Pynchon. He has presented internationally on Pynchon's novels and their ambiguous technological visions. He can be found on Twitter at The Wasted World and blogs at thewastedworld.wordpress.com. If you wish to support Hermetics Podcast, please find the Patreon, merchandise and donation links in the description below. Enjoy. So, Gregory Marks, thanks very much for joining us on Hermetics.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
As per this podcast, the first question here is the Hermetics Question, which is if you could place three thinkers, living or dead, within a room and listen in on the conversation, who do you pick and why?
So, first of all, I think I'd choose the philosopher Gilles Deleuze as, I think, a preeminent, particularly important, I think, for Pynchon studies, as a preeminent philosopher of desire and the capture and control of desire by exterior forces. Secondly, I'd pick Walter Benjamin as, I think, a preeminent thinker of the failures of modernity, but also the haunting of this modernity by its sort of unrealized futures and sort of horrific pasts. And so, yeah, and thirdly, I was hesitant to pick Pynchon himself due to his infamous reclusivity. But, I figure, why not? And I think I'd really wonder what he'd have to say just to these sort of more critical figures like Benjamin and Deleuze, who I think cross paths with him thematically, even as they come from these sort of radically different political and philosophical backgrounds.
Yeah. So, if I could ask, what do you make of Pynchon's reclusivity? I mean, obviously, this could just be a very personal thing, like it was for Salinger, but I wonder how much his reclusive nature is now this sort of is part of almost his makeup. It's like an attack on everything that he's critiquing in his books. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I'm not really certain, because there is that, I guess, mythos around Pynchon's reclusivity, that at various points in time it was speculated that he was actually a think tank or a group, that he may have actually been J.D. Salinger or the Unabomber or someone like that. But I think it's actually far more mundane than that I think early on in his career he had made a choice not to have that public persona, and through the years, he has played with that to a large extent, including sending a comedian up to impersonate him for an award that he won in the 70s, and even referencing his own lack of appearance in his appearance on The Simpsons, I think in the early 2000s. So I think it's easy to sort of fall into a kind of Pynchonian narrative around Pynchon himself. But what we do know about him, it just seems like he's a fairly sort of personal guy who just doesn't want to have that literary celebrity surrounding him.
Yeah, I think it always seemed to me, I mean, there's this brilliant clip on some news channel in America, I think from quite a while ago now, where Pynchon, I think, allowed himself to be filmed, but the clip they show is of kind of about 3 or 4 clips in a row of like crowds of people, and they're like, Pynchon is one of these people, and I kind of like I like the tongue-in-cheek humour of that, and I think he kind of realises that even if he was kind of found out or interviewed, I think he understands that really that's always going to be a disappointment to people. Like, not that he'd be disappointing, but it's not going to be the same as. It's kind of like Ballard. When people met Ballard, they were really not so much disappointed, but it wasn't. You're not going to get a man who is literally Pynchonian, some kind of drug-addled, paranoid, kind of loose cannon. I imagine he's quite a sturdy type.
Yeah, like that clip from I think it was CNN tracked him down in the 90s, and yeah, it was apparently like they'd snapped a picture of him with his young son, somewhere on the streets of New York. And so I think in some sense, like even like he sent them a very strongly worded letter requesting that the photograph not be published. So I think it ties into that sort of refusal to let his private life become public and to become this spectacle. Although there are, of course, all these, rumours within Pynchon circles about folks who had run into him at, a pub on Long Island or that he'd come into a library to do some sort of research, and he seemed a fairly amicable guy, but on that sort of face-to-face level without the mediation of the news cycle and so on.
So how did you come across the work of Thomas Pynchon, and why did it interest you enough to write your thesis on it?
Well, I guess I first encountered him as an undergraduate. I was studying English. I guess I figured it was time to tackle those difficult novels or great novels or whatever you want to call them. And I saw Gravity's Rainbow getting mentioned quite frequently. Yeah, when I read it, at the time was this quite, I think, formative experience. It seemed to, sort of include everything, or anything else I read in the year or two following it seemed to somehow tie back to some fragment within that text. So, suffice it to say, I ended up reading the rest of his novels and then wrote my honours thesis on him, particularly on paranoia and history in a couple of his novels. So, although oddly enough, when starting my PhD, Pynchon was just going to be a jumping off point to talk about the postmodern historical novel more broadly, but eventually I figured I wasn't quite done with him, that there was something else to be said about his work, which I figured I could address in some way. So now here I am, far too many years later, attempting to finish this thesis. Yeah.
Right. Well, I found that interesting there, that when you first read Gravity's Rainbow, you said that all the texts you read afterwards. So Gravity's Rainbow was published in 1970...
73, I think. Yeah.
So everything you said you read afterwards felt like it tied into a fragment. Could you expand on that? That's quite an interesting thing to say there.
Yeah, it's... because it is it has no real central, identifiable plot to it. It has a series of characters who will recur and show up more or less frequently. But the novel just jumps around throughout history, throughout the world, and then is able to engage with just a sheer sort of massive, both historical and literary and philosophical research that reasons where people suspected that Pynchon was perhaps a conglomerate of people, that one guy surely couldn't know all of these things, which I think my reading of the book has settled down a little since then. But yeah, it certainly it fits within that encyclopedic sort of strain of fiction that would include things like Ulysses and so on. Although oddly enough, it was sort of the opposite reaction that I had to the Crying of Lot 49 that I'd read earlier, which didn't grab me at all. I felt like nothing connected. It was it was almost fortuitous that I ended up reading Gravity's Rainbow and having that connection.
Yeah, it's funny you say that about the Crying of Lot 49, because I had the same experience, except I found that almost strangely not so much helpful, but I think it was intended, because we'll get to Pynchon's conspiracy and paranoia later, but the conspiracy element of the Crying of Lot 49 is ramped up so high that you and the protagonist are almost unable to make any connections, and then it just sort of ends. And that book, as you said, is it's a very disconnected book.
Yeah, I'd almost say that it's disconnected, but in the way it's so short and so compact, it's almost like it's almost like a gem of a novel, right? Where not in the sense of being necessarily valuable, but in the sense of being like, if you're able to put it up to that sort of right perspective and that right kind of light, it's sort of able to come together in a way that I don't think happens with his larger novels. Lot 29, it has that reputation of being I think for that reason, as a novel that people try to solve, to sort of give an answer to the mystery that is never answered in the final pages, which I think is really the value of that book itself, is that it refuses you as a reader. It sort of doesn't allow you to have that conclusion or that final narrative.
So, how would you describe Pynchon's work to a kind of an avid reader who hasn't tackled him yet? And why did you think it was so important that you had to embark on a PhD on Pynchon?
Well, how do I describe him? I think in simplest terms, like without getting into the simplest way to describe a lot of his fiction is simply as kind of wacky or zany historical novels, which I think function as kind of sort of elegies for forgotten moments of crisis, when history could have turned out differently. So, texts like Gravity's Rainbow being set during the Second World War, or Mason and Dixon just prior to the American Revolution. Some of his works that, are set either in the 60s or just after, and attempting to reckon with what happened with the to counterculture in the 20th century. So I think they're really attempts to grapple with this, I guess, failure of politics or of technology in society in the 20th century to create worlds better than the ones that have preceded them, or rather maybe to prevent things from getting worse, or from control and conspiracy from propagating. Yeah, which, at least to my mind, is fairly important for this kind of fiction. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And did you see the importance of that in relation to our current atmosphere, politically and technologically, or was it simply that, as you said, these novels are targeting moments in time that are just kind of... We mentioned earlier about his encyclopedic knowledge, and it does seem that way, that when you read these novels, it is like a barrage of forgotten tiny moments, and I often found myself thinking, where in the hell did Pynchon find this bit of information? Because it's so almost useless. It's almost like he's gone back in time and just listened to a random conversation between two just members of the public, no one really important, and he has a real sense of kind of time in that manner, that he can take you back, because the information is often so mundane. It's as if you're reading a Sunday kind of TV brochure as opposed to a novel. So in that way, was the importance to do with for you to do with kind of, it's a cliche to say kind of Trump and all this kind of heavily charged political atmosphere, but was it in relation to that, or was it simply as a kind of, he's very good at articulating a marker in time?
Yeah, well, at least on my mind, I think he's always quite prescient in his fiction. Even as he looks back to moments in the past, he's obviously reading them through the lens in which he was writing, or the time in which he was writing. But I think that focus on, the failure of political movements, or the co-option of various sort of desires for change, I think it's absolutely still relevant and present today. And in his latest novel, he really pushes that boundary. Bleeding Edge was published, I think, in 2013, but it's set in 2001. Mm-hmm. Immediately after the .com bubble, and over the course of 9/11. So, but it's written in the same style as his historical novels, right? So it takes this moment in time that was barely a decade gone, and he treats it as this, as though it's as distant as the colonial era or the Second World War, and sort of forces us to examine that recent past through this long lens of asking, well, where is this going exactly, and how this feeds into our, present predicaments.
In that way, then, he's sort of extremely aware of the accelerative effect of modernity, that everything does. 2001 does seem almost now, at least in terms of technology, which we'll get onto, does seem as far away as the colonial era almost, when we think about the differences in how we were living, and especially the things which were coming about in 2001, which we were just seeing the first glimpses of, kind of almost, at least in the Western world, universal computer use, just the beginnings of smartphones and constant communication. And now that seems like almost the Edgar Wright era of, what planes is to them, what technology is to us. It just seems archaic, and what were we actually doing? We were still reading newspapers, which seems absurd now. So this brings, when I was thinking about Pynchon, my readings of Pynchon, and I was reading your essays, which is
no, it's
a Wasted World.
It's a WordPress blog, The Wasted World.
Wasted World. It will be linked in the description. But yeah, so when I was reading your essays, the two overarching themes, it seems, for Pynchon one is paranoia and one is technology. So I think if we start with the first one, which seems like a strange theme, because it seems that how do you base a theme around a subjective feeling? So so Pynchon's paranoid, or many of his characters are paranoid about whether or not people are kind of being malicious, whether or not the time is kind of out to get them, or something's out to get them. There's this constant sense of something almost following them from behind. Do you think there's a big difference between, how do we read Pynchon's paranoia?
Yeah, I think that's really the big question as well. That perhaps it's sort of from my background of going through the various books written in Pynchon studies, I tend to see the paranoid element as being kind of overstated in the way that it's already an overt theme for Pynchon, that he'll constantly return specifically to that word paranoia to describe his characters, or how his characters describe themselves, which I think certainly is quite overt in his early novels, which are like the main characters tend to be these like loner types, these types that are sort of cut off from society at large and who are forced to make some kind of sense of the various sort of chaotic events in which they find themselves. But I think as his writing progresses, through the various decades that he's been writing, I think paranoia tends to take a bit more of a backseat and reveal what I think is the crucial, I guess, emotional charge of the novels, is that really drives the paranoia, is that of a kind of anxiety around identity and selfhood and humanity as well. So, his characters constantly return to these sort of questions of exactly, who they are, who's pulling their strings, exactly how much autonomy they have over their own lives and their own choices in life. And they often find paranoid answers that sort of overreach and end up in these totalizing narratives where everything seems to fit perfectly together for that character alone. But at the base of it, I think that anxiety is a product of a kind of your constant technological transformation of reality and of bodies and of selfhood as well. So that I think before any of these characters really, encounter a paranoid vision of the world, or create a paranoid vision, they first find themselves, or they're thought of themselves upset in some way. They find that they've been, pre-programmed by, psychoanalytic practices, that, they see the city in which they live as a giant, clockwork machine in which they are merely a cog, or something along those lines. So that paranoia tends to be this end point, right? But it always begins with this sort of upset of normality by modernity, I think.
And one of the things that Pynchon does, which I love, which I think he does very tongue-in-cheekly, and I think one of the best examples of is in Inherent Vice, and he stacks paranoia to make you realise how lost these people are. So the protagonist is kind of, in that novel, he's almost already clinically not a very stable person, and on top of and he's very kind of absent-minded as well. And on top of this, he's smokes a gratuitous amount of weed, and also he's within the 70s, which is this era of scandal and conspiracy. And on top of this, he's a private investigator. So his entire life is based around basically just being lost and asking questions all the time. And within this, you're entirely lost within, and eventually you just kind of accept it. You go, well, we're not going to get the answers here. Which was, might I say, when I went to see the film version of this, was it was much to the dismay of quite a lot. You often hear of people walking out of cinemas, but I actually did witness quite a few people walk out of the film. And usually people do this. I think this is a good comment on society in general now. People used to do this when it was too gory or full on. Now they don't. Now they do it because they know they're not going to get any answers. So just in a frustration, right? This isn't going anywhere. I'm not going to get any conclusions. I'm leaving. Which I think is probably a good comment Pynchon himself. But you mentioned the technology, and he does comment a lot on technology, but it's not, he's not commenting directly about computers. He's commenting on what they're kind of doing to us, and this does tie into his one of his very strange, and just you wonder why it's there. His essay on Luddite. Is it okay to be a Luddite? So, what do we make of Pynchon's critique of technology?
Yeah, well, I think in the Luddite essay, ironically, it's quite ambiguous. Even though, of course, the title of the essay is it okay to be a Luddite? To which the answer quite explicitly and quite early in the essay is yes. But then I think the real core of the essay is asking, well, what is a Luddite and what does it mean in a predominantly technological and, at the time he was writing, an increasingly digital age? And I think to answer that, he curiously returns to that, moment in the late 18th century and early 19th century, and looks at the Gothic novels of the time, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which he interprets them as being these essentially Luddite novels, these statements about not only the dangers of technology, but precisely how we can, in his words, deny the machine by means of subterfuge, darkness, and all these other Gothic adjectives. Mm-hmm. Although that being said, the end of that essay, as much as he's sort of said, Luddism is absolutely viable in the 20th century, it ends ambiguously, as I think the final image of that essay is this question about, what happens when we all have, personal computers and TVs in every home and so on, and will, even the most hardline of Luddites be tempted to put down the hammer and take up, the typewriter. And so instead it ends with this kind of question of whether technology can actually be repurposed in some way for a Luddite cause. In this case, Frankenstein's monster is the principal figure. That it's not the humans themselves, but it's rather the creation turned against its creator that becomes the Luddite hero. It's perhaps the machines themselves will win the day for the Luddite cause if we cannot.
Mm-hmm. I was interested there because your essays and your thesis is related to the Gothic in relation to Pynchon, and you said about the Gothic adjectives there in relation to kind of stamping on the machine or getting rid of the machine. So could you expand on the Gothic ways of destroying the machine?
I think essentially Pynchon a statement about aesthetics and the role of literature, so that it's not only a task of the sort of revolutionary Luddites of history, but the people who wrote those kinds of narratives. And I think Pynchon is in a way talking about his own fiction, the way that he constructs these ideas around technology. He is himself kind of negative means by means of paranoia and anxiety and so on, to create this sense of resistance to machines and to technology, which I don't think it's necessarily a broad statement about all of Gothic fiction, but certainly that core of fiction like Frankenstein.
Of course, the one thing with technology is of course its relation to man. That's the main thing we're talking about here, and we've got man. Mm. And what is happening to him in these Pynchonian universes when he firstly, when he comes into contact with machines and technology, but what happens when he finally submits?
I think it changes over the course of Pynchon's career. In his early fiction, it tends towards a kind of cyborgism and the horror of becoming part human, part machine. So novels like V and Gravity's Rainbow return to these images of bodily and psychic amalgamation with machines, to the point that identifying a human life unaltered by machine becomes quite difficult. But in his later fiction, I think it's a lot more subtle. There's more of a sense of an integration into a system of machinery, so that it's no longer a question of the individual self being transformed by machinery, but already having been transformed or conditioned in some way by these mechanisms of control.
And that actually goes back to one of your early thinkers there, Walter Benjamin, who he had a lot to say about these systems of control. And Deleuze as well, actually, kind of fragmenting off from Foucault there. So it's not, often I think the problem is people think about machines and technology, and I think most people's minds go to the aesthetic of computers and binary and code, etc. But really, what we're talking about is this conspiratorial kind of spirit that's running through everything, that's running away from man. The human's kind of disappearing, and he can't grasp onto anything other than what kind of technology is allowing him.
Although at the same time, I think although that's sort of the broad movement that in history, there are always those moments of escape as well, or these sort of remnants that are they're in some way unassimilable to the machines, or in some way recoup something from that integration. So he returns to the imagery of the preterite, or the unelect, as the figures who are not only forgotten by history or cast aside in some way, but by their separation from these systems are able to make something else for themselves. So in a way, this anything that's able to slip through the gaps is able to be freer than anyone who's attempts to simply work with the machines.
Do you think he's for slipping through the gaps, or do you think he's sitting back and just seeing what happens?
Yeah, I think the latter probably, especially in that language of preterition and the unelect. It's not really our choice whether we are the saved or the damned, but rather we make of it what we can. So I think certainly there's something in Pynchon that is, I think especially in his early work, quite nihilistic, of simply watching everything unravel. Although in his later fiction there is more of a sense of the, attempts to create communities that are able to resist or escape in some way. Yeah, so his fiction tends to shift from a kind of horror of the individual under pressure to these sort of visions of a kind of communal or familial, utopias that are able to maintain themselves.
I'm just going to jump back to because another kind of key thing. So, in one of your essays, you say, in typical Pynchonian fashion, the novel diverges from history at almost every turn. So we've kind of commented on the fact that, Gravity's Rainbow is more of this encyclopedic collection of events as opposed to a linearity. And Pynchon loves this. He loves fragmentation. He loves non-linearity. Just, I think, as a sort of device. And it does seem chaotic when you first meet it. But as you say, there is recurrence in it. There is recurring characters, there's recurring themes. So what can we make of Pynchon's usage of time as a kind of device?
Well, I think partly, and tying back to the point I made earlier about his novels being kind of elegies for sort of forgotten moments of the past, I think there is that sense of, I guess, what we could call like lost time in his novels, that characters always, and only too late, realise that something could have changed, or something could have been done to change their world. So there's that, I think, recurring sense of lost possibilities in time or in history. But even as his characters end in these, I think, unfortunate or uncertain situations, the novels themselves actually fulfill what his characters can only dream of, in the ways that he writes these counterfactual histories in which, although he's able to summon all of these incredible details about the past, there's always something slightly changed about them, and obviously made fictive but also fantastical, so that even as time and history seem to march on and possibilities are lost, there is that simply in reading his fiction, there's that sense of the sheer amount of things which teem in any moment of history, and the possibilities that can be realised at any point, even if they, more often than not, are not.
Mm-hmm. And there's another brilliant quote in one of your essays. It's quite a long one. So, what first appears as an escape from modern time, so we're going back to time here, is in fact folded into a deeper logic of capitalism, as the halts and starts of other times find themselves in the service of the same laws of production and accumulation. So Pynchon, I think, undoubtedly, maybe he just has to deal with capitalism. I don't know if this... I don't know too much about Pynchon's studies here, and I don't know what other comments are regarding him, his work in capitalism, but there is a connection with Pynchon, capitalism, time, and also technology there. Kind of, it's constantly just starting and stopping. So what do you kind of make of this are these kind of small conclusions, these encapsulated events in Gravity's Rainbow or in his other works where it's just a culmination of events, are these the only conclusions that we can kind of have now?
Guys, I'm not certain. Because I think... No, I think if it's about the question of, capitalism and, anti-capitalism, I think Pynchon does really put forward this sense of, possibilities of escape in his in one of his essays titled "Nearer My Couch to Thee." He writes about the secularization of the deadly sin of sloth, which was once a kind of sin against God, but today is a sin against time, and particularly the time of production. So that there is that sense in Pynchon's work that there is that continual ability to not go with the flow and to jam up the machine in some way, even by perhaps being a slacker or something along those lines. As for Pynchon's conclusions, I think even as his novels tend to track a kind of downward curve of modernity, his novels always end with a kind of utopian or salvific image of either community restored or of escape to something outside the present order. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, because these the events are kind of conclusions in themselves, and there is this kind of form of exit. But I'm very interested. I hadn't read the essay that you commented on there. That this sloth as rebellion, and the idea that capitalist time, the sin now is to waste what is only seen as a means to be productive. This comes across now. I now realise in droves in Inherent Vice when. My mind has gone blank for the characters' names, unfortunately, but the protagonist, he's constantly coming in communication with this, I believe he's a police chief, who's kind of this archetypal post-World War II authoritarian, extremely repressed kind of leader type, who clearly is in love with kind of production and authority and leadership and control. And obviously the protagonist is the stoner on the fringes of hippiedom and things like this. So these two are kind of archetypes that are just so opposite to each other, it's almost slapstick. But, of course, the frustration, I guess, for the leader type there is that the protagonist is a complete sloth. He's not really doing too much with his time, and I think that's it's like a non-rebellion against... The only way you can compete against capitalism is just be lazy. A form of rebellion against capitalism is to be lazy and to be a sloth. Does this appear elsewhere in Pynchon's work? So I think even in the sense that the way that paranoia feeds into Pynchon's novels, I think in a way ties into that as well. That it's often difficult to make sense of exactly what the point of all the paranoia in Pynchon's fiction is. That he's not only attempting to give us a sense of a kind of a psychology of characters or anything like that, but the sort of the paranoid plots that these characters attempt to uncover are themselves a kind of wasting of time. I think the best example is The Crime of Lot 49, where even as the character feels, or the protagonist feels, that she's uncovering some great mystery of the universe, nothing really happens in the novel, or nothing really happens from her own actions. So that even this sort of seeking out of some kind of I guess paranoia as practice is this refusal to actually make sense, to follow a clear pattern of reason, of having to produce something sensible at the end of your labours. Yeah. Okay. So what do you clearly in your essays are you're working with capitalism a lot. What can we make of Pynchon with respect to capitalism and kind of in general?
Yeah, in general, I think it is a big question of exactly what Pynchon's politics are and how they've changed over the years. I think throughout his work he's clearly anti-capitalist, but there's a question of exactly how I think systematically he thinks about capitalism. I think when I first read his works, the sense I got was that it was something of either a kind of a hippie or kind of naive anarchist kind of perspective, that he seems to be less interested in capitalism as opposed to the man or the system. But the more that I reread his fiction, especially his later fiction like Mason and Dixon, I find that there is a real attention to the economies that shape the worlds that he depicts, and particularly those economies of time, of how characters spend their time and spend their lives and what they produce from those actions. There's this incredible scene in Mason and Dixon where one of the protagonists is caught in a whirlpool in time when Britain updated from the Julian to Gregorian calendar. They'd lost 11 days, and this character gets stuck in those 11 days in this sort of parallel London in which nobody lives, and he hears all of this the tumult and cries of everything that is not allowed in the age of reason. But he also hears whispers of colonists being sent to these 11 days that run alongside our own time to create plantations in time and harness this whole other world. For some nefarious means of capital accumulation or whatever. So even as Pynchon is having a bit of a laugh about, this sort of, weird moment in history, he's tying it back into this, I think, grander narrative about the not only control of people and of resources, but also of time and economies of time, which I think is, essentially he's talking about capitalism in quite a systematic way.
Mm-hmm. Which is that's interesting, because one of your thinkers at the start there was Deleuze, who obviously had a lot to comment about. One can read his work in a pessimistic way to kind of conclude that humans, to a certain degree, are just culminations of these desires. But the problem there is that they're not the human's own desires, and this seems to come across in Pynchon. And from what you've just described there, it seems that not only in time but everything, the forces of desire, the forces of time, the forces of production, humans are lost. The actual human itself is just entirely lost to these other forces, and it's almost as if in Pynchon's novels you have pages and pages where the theme is actually this underlying force, and the humans are just kind of nodes that are there just to articulate what the force does. I don't know what you'd make of that reading there. Yeah,
again, I think I'd sort of bring that back to a split between his early and late novels. So his early novels being V, Crying Lot 49 and Gravity's Rainbow, after which there was a hiatus between the publication of Gravity's Rainbow in 1973 and Vineland in 1990. And I think in his early works, those first three novels, there is that real sense that people don't matter. I think even down to the sort of ridiculous names that he gives his characters, even as fictional constructs, they seem some of them seem almost as one-off jokes. And these novels will then return to these broad pictures of like the gears of history turning and people being lost within them. But yeah, I don't think that really holds in his later novels. I think in Vineland and Mason and Dixon and the novels that follow those two, there is a clear sense of, I think, what is at stake for people as individuals and as sort of members of communities. Yeah.
I don't know. Now that you've said the hiatus times, I'm not sure that's entirely surprising, because it's 1973 to 1990. We see we see the decade there of the 80s, basically the Reaganite and Thatcher, for me, era of ramping capitalism into absolute overdrive. And I think perhaps Pynchon, I guess I assume I don't know his biography too well, but growing up in the around the 60s and 70s, saw that even though it is quite commodified, even in its own time, as a sort of escape, and seeing the loss, and probably also seeing the same people who were in the 60s and 70s become everything that they were against in the 60s and 70s. So that loss of the human, once again, is down to kind of capital subsuming it and just saying it doesn't care.
Yeah. So it's actually interesting in that his first novel after his hiatus, Vineland, is about precisely that gap, in that it's set in the 80s and follows a group of just washed up hippies and ex-radicals as they attempt to navigate the new world of Reagan, right? But funnily enough, I think without giving too much of the plot away, the book ends with the villain of the story, who is again another sort of disgusting, macho, I guess, cop type who works for some American intelligence agency. At the end of the book, he's whisked away because his funding has been cut. So, the sort of spectre of Reagan hovers over even the villains of Pynchon's novels.
Even the kind of archetype of good and evil is at the whim of capital to just kind of remove it in an absurd. Yeah, you no longer have any money, so it no longer even. It doesn't even matter to the actual meta narrative of the novel anymore. But because I think there is a difference between the paranoia and... Because I guess paranoia is the feeling that you believe something is happening. And I don't know... I'm not sure if there is a difference between paranoia and conspiracy, but his conspiracies are very light-hearted. It's even if they were true, it seems that they would just be absurd and silly. And do you think this is what we kind of mean by Pynchonian, by just this absurd... I'm sure something's going on, but I really have absolutely no clue where to even begin. Do you think that's getting close to what we could mean by Pynchonian?
Yeah, I think to some extent he does hide quite serious conspiracies within that, I think, lighthearted veneer. So that I think, again, the big example is Gravity's Rainbow, which, even as the main events surrounding the protagonist are, quite absurd. They're pretty zany, but in the background there'll be all these little references to collusion between Allied and Axis businesses during the Second World War, the funneling away of Nazi scientists in Operation Paperclip and so on. And so even as the main bulk of the story doesn't draw your attention to it, Gravity's Rainbow is just sort of chock full of these, real accounts of conspiracy, so that he's able to sort of slip in, I think, quite, sort of provocative narratives within a lighthearted kind of Pynchonian attitude.
So one of the last questions here, it's quite a kind of heavy and big one, but you say that Pynchon posits that in our secular age, the religious yearning for another world is not dispelled, but displaced. So that's kind of, it's displaced among other things. And it does seem to me that technology is the answer to that question to a certain extent for Pynchon. So technology is our new religion. What do you think Pynchon makes of our belief in it?
I think he attempts to offer alternate visions of technology and the technologized world that we live in. Because I think on the one hand he does try to address the very real desires that that technology is able to, or particular technologies are able to satisfy in some way. I think the best example that comes to my mind is in Vineland. There are these characters known as the Thanatoids, who are these kind of sort of zombie-like figures. They don't do much, but they sit around in front of the TV all day, because in ages past, ghosts would remain due to unfinished business. But today, the dead remain in our world because they want to know how their TV shows end. And so, in some way, I think, like, as much as he's having a go at that, the idea of the the brain dead generation of TV. There's also that sense that that kind of media and that kind of technology is addressing a lack, this sort of lack of closure or narrative that could make sense of the world. And I think to return to his Luddite essay, in that essay he quite explicitly states that the purpose of fiction, whether it's the Gothic fiction that he returns to or his own fiction, is to insist that miracles are still possible. Miracles which may be either of a supernatural nature or of a technological nature. That essentially it's still possible for the laws that govern this world to be suspended and for the world to be turned upside down. So that even as he condemns technology on the one hand as this this opiate of the people, or whatever you want to call it, there is still this utopian vision, I think, and this possibility that all the technical means at our disposal could be turned to better uses. But exactly how that occurs is sort of left quite ambiguous.
It's well, I always find myself returning to this quote, and it frustrates me how often it's right. But the quote, which is the difference between technology and magic, is, I can't even remember the quote, but magic and
it's a Arthur C. Clarke quote, yeah.
Technology is indiscernible from magic. Basically, magic is indiscernible from any sufficiently advanced technology, I think.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So what we used to kind of consider, in feudalist or medieval times, or up until I'd say probably the early 18th century is when magic starts to take its kind of fall. That is, and you look at history, that is exactly when the Age of Enlightenment comes in, and we're just giving an aesthetic to magic. Really, we're saying, instead of saying a magical happening happened, we're just saying, oh, it comes from that machine, which I don't think really answers what it actually is that's happening in itself. And so all these miracles are replaced by, even now, actually, you make it clear that the other parts of magic, so ghosts, spirits, etc., all these things are still existent in culture as like remnants of an old magic culture, but they've found their way into technology. But one thing so your thesis is on the Pynchon and the Gothic?
Yeah, I'm using the term the posthuman Gothic specifically, but...
So how do we define the posthuman Gothic?
Essentially, it's the Gothic that's preoccupied with the transformations of the human in some way or another. So, it can be linked back to the kind of narratives you see in Frankenstein, where a kind of superhuman creation threatens to replace humanity in some way. But I think it also stretches to writers like, J.G. Ballard, who will write about the sort of way that environments influence sort of human behaviour and human thought. I think the key definition I would use for the posthuman is by N. Catherine Hales in her book How We Became Posthuman, in which she writes that if the human was traditionally defined by its autonomy of will and of reason, the posthuman is post not because it's necessarily unfree, but because it's impossible to distinguish one's own will and reason from any other exterior force that may be acting upon us. So in that case, it's particularly the sort of discoveries of cybernetics and so on. But it can also be brought into, I think, sort of discussions around ecology and so on as well.
Mm-hmm. So the point where we become posthuman in this relation is when we sort of accept that we aren't this separate thing, and we finally allow ourselves to be tethered to these other forces, which in Pynchon's case would be. So Pynchon really is extremely posthuman. By you mentioned Deleuze, and Deleuze writes about kind of channeling your neurosis and your paranoia so it becomes something else, and obviously Walter Benjamin as well of our being tethered to technology. So do you see these things that, in the way Pynchon writes about them, as distinctly kind of posthuman?
Yeah, definitely, and. Not necessarily in the same way that Hales would think about it. I think in her case, we're already post-human, and it's just a case of recognising it. and recognizing our finitude and our predetermination by our environments. And I think Pynchon still holds to some idea of the human as this, autonomous individual. But it's always one that's under siege in some way, or is anxious about its position in the universe. So, which is why I think I'd tie it into the Gothic specifically, rather than just being posthuman, in that he returns this anxiety around the possibility of being posthuman, and this anxiety that's always expressed in these, ambiguous or negative ways, which I think are best expressed in Gothic terms.
So how do you define Gothic?
I think the easiest working definition that I use is Fred Botting's definition, which is that the Gothic is a genre of negative aesthetics. So it's preoccupied with the sort of powers of horror and of terror, which unsettle us and aren't immediately pleasurable, but in some way, by upsetting what we know or believe we know about the world and about ourselves, in some way, create this either overflow of affect and of fear, or of a kind of release and a new understanding of ourselves.
So where do you see the Gothic fitting in with Pynchon? How come you made that connection?
Partly because I think it's something that's been less examined in Pynchon studies, which, it's changing a little now, but it's tended to see Pynchon purely through the frames of postmodern aesthetics, of pastiche and reference and all those elements. And I felt there's something that's been less acknowledged, are those moments of horror or terror in Pynchon's fiction. And I also think it's also just reading some of his nonfiction, like the Luddite essay, in which I think it's the one work of his in which he explicitly probably one of the few texts in which he sort of names a kind of precursor to himself, which is Frankenstein, right? So, what little we know about Pynchon is that he was a big fan of the Beats and sees Frankenstein as this prototypical Luddite novel. So that I think even in his own words, there's a kind of Gothic spirit at work.
Where would you advise people to begin with Pynchon then?
Probably with The Crying of Lot 49. As his shortest novel, it's probably also his easiest. And it's also a good taste of what to expect with other novels of that period, such as V or Gravity's Rambo. As I think I said earlier, it's quite condensed as this kind of compact gem, like a tiny conspiratorial machine, so that it really rewards rereading as well, of trying to put the various pieces of it together and perhaps becoming a practitioner of paranoia yourself. That being said, I'd say that Mason and Dixon is easily my favourite, not only because I think it is his most sort of endearing novel with the sort of most human characters, but also in the way that it sends us back in time further than any of his other novels and gives us a kind of genealogy of the machineries and the unrealised desires that are then present in his other works.
Gregory Marks, thanks very much for joining us, talking about Pynchon.
Well, thank you very much.